Hello and welcome to the Overview Effect podcast. I am your host, Dane Jordan, and with me, my co-host, Thomas Dunlap. We are on episode 10, and to celebrate, we brought on our first guest ever, Mr. Evan Jordan. Happens to have the same last name. We happen to share the same family, but we're not related, in case you're wondering.
Important distinction.
Do we have the applause, like the little applause sound effect?
Mentally, we'll just put that out.
There you go. We'll do it in post. Do it in post.
So
welcome, Evan.
Yes, welcome, Evan, to the podcast. How's it going?
Glad to be here. Going pretty well.
Awesome. Yeah, so Thomas and I have discussed briefly on previous episodes evolution. I think the question came up, is evolution necessary for life? And we came to the conclusion no, but in expressing that, or rather exploring that idea,
Wait, say that again, Dane?
What's that?
Say that part again, that statement. Is evolution. Go ahead.
Yeah, is evolution necessary? Is evolution rather not necessary, but inevitable? Or no, rather, back it up. Intelligence, and then we went into it. Yeah,
I heard is evolution necessary for life, and I was like,
intelligence necessary.
Intelligence.
Yeah, we came to thank you for the correction. We came to the conclusion no, but it was an interesting. We started branching down the ideas of evolution, and I thought, hey, I know someone with a degree in evolution, so thought we'd bring in Evan, who got a degree of evolution, ecology, and biodiversity from UC Davis. I got that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to spring it open. Thomas, yeah, go ahead, Thomas.
I was just going to say, what does that actually mean? A degree in was it evolutionary ecology?
Evolution, ecology, and biodiversity. A number of colleges will have a major with the words evolution and ecology in it, and Davis had to go one step further and add biodiversity in there.
There you go.
But yeah, the major is essentially it's a biology major with a heavy emphasis in evolution and ecology. And while they are different subjects, they are so closely intertwined that you can't really study one without studying the other, because ecology is the interaction of species within an environment, and evolution is how species change over time. And how species change depends on how they interact with their environment and other species, and how they interact depends on how they've evolved, and so they've become pretty much inseparable, and so you can't really teach one without teaching the other.
And was there, as far as different majors in evolution that you could take, or is that like the one that was for you particularly that was the only one to take, or are there different ways to kind of explore a degree in evolution?
Well, as far as Davis goes, no. There's only one. There's one major. It's evolution, ecology, biodiversity. As far as you do have a wide range of courses you can take to fulfill the major. There's plant ecology, there's community ecology, there's global ecology. There's you can focus more on evolution. You can evolutionary history. A lot of modern evolution is done solely with computers and DNA, using let's see, what is it called? Bayes theorem, Monte Carlo. Something or other. If you take sequences of DNA and you know the rate of mutation, the probability of mutation, then you can compare two strands of DNA or many strands, many samples, and run it through statistical analysis and come up with probable evolutionary trees. And so that's how all evolutionary research is done today, is really fast computers and DNA sequencing.
Oh, that's really interesting. So now there's, there's a couple different aspects or a couple different ways to kind of drive down there, but unpack that. But were you biting for time in terms of on some of these, are these super fast computers to be able to run some of these models? Or did you get to see how some of these models worked, or do you do programming, or maybe elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah. So I took a class, computational evolution, and yeah, I saw some of the computers. I mean, they weren't supercomputers by any means. They're just using parts you can buy at Newegg or PC parts. It's funny. I went to my professor's lab, and he had the exact same PC case that I do, except his was loaded, and he had graphics. Well, a couple of graphics cards, but mostly he had like 128 gigs of RAM, i9s, and just mega processors, so you can run them a lot quicker.
Does he have like the whole? I'm picturing a gaming setup where there's RGB lights. He's occasionally playing Grand Theft Auto over here or Call of Duty.
Yeah, I told him that if he had no RGB lights, but I told him that if he installed it, he'd get even faster speeds. But I don't know. He didn't believe me on that. Yeah,
that's a fundamental law of the universe. Even I know that one. Yeah, RGB lights go fast.
But yes, it's certainly it's a Swiss Army knife of a computer. You can run Grand Theft Auto 5 with 1 million frames per second, or find out how a bunch of bees evolved, which was what he was running at the moment. It was like 3 weeks of runtime for a certain, deducting the phylogeny is just another way of saying evolutionary tree of a bunch of species of bumblebee.
So is this taking the current state and kind of retrodicting like what it must have been to get to that state?
Yeah.
And then trying to like extrapolate forward as well? Or are you just working to what we know? Or are we working for what we know and then what we're marching towards? Or like open that up a little bit.
Yeah. As far as predicting, not really. They weren't looking for predictions of where they might evolve. It's finding the most likely evolutionary relationship between existing species. So it's sort of like if you took yourself and a handful of second cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins, but you don't know which person is which second or third cousin. You take DNA. Okay, so this there were this many common ancestors. Our common ancestor was this many generations ago. Because you can tell how different the DNA is. That's a poor example because that doesn't involve mutation. If we're talking the time scales of, not a few generations, but hundreds of thousands of years, where DNA differs based on mutation rather than in the cousin aspect. That's just recombination. So bad example there, but no, you're using DNA to find not what must be the relationship, because there are any number of possible evolutionary relationships, but the most probable one.
And does this tie into where you're actually, are these trained AI models that are actually being used or leveraged in terms of this? Or okay,
there are, at least what I learned. I'm sure machine learning is probably will probably be implemented, but this is. What I learned was no neural networks, no AI or any of that, but it's just I think it's multi-chain Monte Carlo, which is it's built upon Bayes' theorem, which I could not explain very well, but it's pretty much it's a statistical equation it's a way of incorporating statistical evidence to find probabilities. And so it's pretty much just, it's running a ton of calculations to find. It's pretty much testing. It's not brute force necessarily, because it does build upon more likely trees, but it takes it takes all the data and it runs a whole bunch of possible combinations and then tests the probability of this tree, modifies it a bit, tests the probability of that tree, and et cetera, and it goes on for millions and millions of calculations.
And then computationally, like you said, that was actually one thing that I was surprised that you said this can take. The one example you gave with your professor was 3 weeks that it was actually running through one of these computations.
Yeah. Yeah.
So is that kind of the norm of what is kind of seen in terms of some of these are even longer than that, or maybe they've been going for years?
Yeah, I mean, as far as for a publishable paper, yeah, I think a few weeks is pretty standard for if you have a few weeks of computation time on your paper and to describe a given relationship. I think the biggest factor of how long it takes is how many species you're working with.
Right.
Yeah, I haven't heard of any year-long computation times, just because I think when you're getting that long, you're running the risk of if the computer dies, then you lose a lot of progress. So it's really just how long you want to leave your computer going.
Yeah, with this study, I'm curious, like what sort of conclusions you had mentioned, like tracing back evolution as well as doing a little bit more of a prediction sort of aspect. What were some like conclusions, if you recall, like that came out of this? And I'm kind of curious, like where it falls into the greater sort of, I guess, sect of evolutionary science and like what we can do with that information.
Yeah. What it gives is likely evolutionary relationships between species. So if you can say with some accuracy when two species diverged at one point and how differently they evolved. If, for example, if you were looking at three species of ant, for example, and if two were more similarly related to each other than either of them were to the third, then you can assume that in the past those two closely related species were one species, and then due to any number of factors, they diverged and then became reproductively isolated. And once they stopped reproducing with each other, then local adaptations and mutations build up without transferring to the other population, and eventually they stop reproducing with each other, or they can't reproduce with each other anymore, and that's when they become two distinct species. And so having that information of knowing when, first of all, how they diverged and when they diverged, you can use to paint evolutionary histories. Especially if you take not even multiple, if you take multiple ant species, and you also incorporate multiple bird species, lizard species, all of these, and if you can find, you can trace, you can find times of rapid diversification and sort of figure out times when there was a lot of environmental change, or if there's a new evolutionary arms race happening and a whole lot of evolution happens really quickly, you can pinpoint where evolution happened and how. That's one application of knowing the evolutionary histories allows you to, lets you learn history. As far as
kind of helping color in just like where we came from. Seems like the sort of a big sort of goal, like understanding the past, as opposed to, for example, in other branches of science, like understanding the genome so that we can create drugs to prevent disease, right? This is more so just kind of coloring in how nature has interacted both from a macro and micro level, like individual species, and what factors then influence the evolution of that species.
Yeah.
And is it clear, like you brought up some things like maybe environmental or rapid divergence, but I'm kind of thinking of it as just an output of a program that is running. Is it interpretation that you're kind of getting at when you actually see the end result and you go, okay, something like this, if this is kind of the output, or after running this program, it kind of gives me this as an output, then it could mean something, like, I don't know, some kind of environmental change or some kind of, new variable being kind of interjected. But how does it, because that seems fairly complex to me. How do you, with all these variables and different changes, is it interpretation that's being implied on top of that?
Yeah. Once it's output, all the output gives is a phylogenetic tree which is if it looks like a family tree, you'll have one node being one species, and then it'll diverge, and it gives the likelihoods of it gives confidence of a certain divergence. So each node, it has each branch, it has a confidence level. It says, okay, 95% sure that these two species diverged at this point, but that's all it gives is a tree and the confidence at each node. And then from then, you take in other information to sort of make interpretations about what the conditions were like in the past that might have led to that.
And one of the other things I was just kind of thinking about is that I could imagine as we find out through other academic studies about what the Earth was like and maybe different influences and factors that, maybe the program when it initially ran wasn't taking into account. So maybe it was modeling something that, input-wise, everything looked good, but it wasn't really grounded in reality. Based on we start learning new facts about history, maybe it's, geological or whatever it is, or different time frames or, heightened solar activity or weather patterns. Do these programs ever get kind of reprocessed or repurposed later on to basically run with kind of new parameters to something like tweaked?
Yeah. It's very flexible in what information you can give. Because the basic parameters that it's running on is very long strands of DNA, A, T, C's, and G's, and you give it a whole bunch of strings of all these characters, and then the other thing it requires is the probability of mutations. So there are several different types of mutations. Each base, an A can mutate to a T, but that is less likely than an A mutating to a C, which might be more likely than to a G, for example. And so having all these probabilities, you can get different trees, but you can also give more specific information, like knowing that perhaps there was, if we're looking, one example is the Isthmus of Panama is a relatively recent formation. A few million years ago, there was no land there, and life could swim back and forth. And so when that arose, when that came out of the ground and separated the ocean, then on each side you start to diverge. The species start to diverge because they can't any mutations or local adaptations that happen in one population on one side of the Isthmus of Panama can't get spread over to the other side. And so if you have a concrete date in mind, then it's quite easy to implement that in. And so okay, at this time divergences are going to be a lot more likely. And then it's very easy to add and change statistical information to get a more clear idea of what's happened.
And so going through all this, and we got pretty heavy there, and I'll probably have some more questions, but that's great detail and actually kind of opens it up in terms of I wasn't really sure what is actually done. I knew computers were used as part of the tool and as part of the understanding to kind of break this down, but that helps me get a sense for it. But for you personally, what was kind of your biggest maybe misconception? Did you have any misconceptions around evolution in general? As far as when kind of before really, spending 4 years, whatever it was, studying it, Did you have any kind of big misconceptions or things that you found really surprising about evolution or anything that you'd kind of share?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think perhaps one of my biggest misconceptions was that evolution was really complicated, and that the one thing that I learned is that there are fundamental rules that evolution is based, that evolution runs on, and part of evolutionary study is finding interesting cases in the wild and then trying to divine how something could happen by identifying how the basic rules of evolution work. So, for example, species act in their own self-interest. Altruism, where individuals of a species help for free, individuals of another species is almost non-existent in nature because, well, if you had two species, one gives resources away for free and one does not, then the one that does not give away resources for free will obviously perform better and reproduce more in the long run. Humans are sort of an asterisk to that rule because, well, we're a little more complicated. And so you look for examples, huh?
I want to jump in. It's actually interesting that you bring that up because we were talking about this last week in our episode. Halfway through the book called Homo Deus, and that topic itself is discussed, like altruism, all these things that we create as humans that I found really interesting. Like there are no ethics, like ethics don't exist. Like we're just all alive. We eat, we breathe, we have sex, and then we die. And then that's it. And then we start create our own meaning to help us live, what we consider better lives. Mm-hmm. And when you say like, oh, this asterisk that happens, it's like, well, what is altruism but like a way to make ourselves feel good? Like what if altruism is just this like warped idea of like, hey, I feel better about myself when I give money to the person on the street. I want to feel better. I want to avoid the feeling of feeling bad by walking by this homeless person who asked me for money and I didn't give him any. I want to avoid that feeling. I want to not feel bad.
Yeah.
And so give him money just because it's a selfish thing, it could totally be, which is really interesting.
Yeah, that's. I remember. Thomas, you can say something.
I was just going to add color to it, which is I can truly believe, like I've done things where I would say that really the reason I've done them is to be, for the better good or altruistic. But what I wonder is if that's just what I'm able to kind of perceive, and underneath really the motivation, like it's just not as accessible to me. But if you go a level deeper, what you'd find out, the way my brain has been wired is really I was doing it for a selfish reason or something that was personally motivated. So I was just kind of adding a little bit of color, not necessarily that somebody is doing it, trying to feel good, but they really think that they're, doing something better for others or trying to do something altruistic, but really there's a hidden motivation.
Yeah. I think one way to kind of boil it down is that from the very base level, when you take nature into consideration, the sort of competition aspect of it is very much like a zero-sum game. Right? It's like if they eat the food, I don't get the food. If I eat the food, they don't get the food, right? It's one or the other. Whereas when it comes to humanity, it's not as black and white. It's like you could do something for someone and not take a hit per se and like make the experience better in general. It's not a zero-sum game, right? And that's, again, what he was talking about in the book is like the pie gets bigger, like the economy grows, more money is around, more food is around. It's not like we're all fighting for the same size of pie here. So I think it's like a possible like evolution of this sort of selfish like base instinct we have as animals on this planet to like, yeah, we want to do things, but it's not as apparently detrimental for other people, because if it's not detrimental for others, it's more so ignored and not actively resisted with laws. No one's a cop's not going to come up and be like, hey, don't give that person money. Like you're hurting yourself. It's like, all right, give money if you want to. Like no one's hurt, especially if it's willing.
Yeah.
When it comes to like, theft, where it's like now it's like a zero-sum game. You get the money or I get the money. That's when, these laws that we've created come into play. I'm like, I don't think that's it's not a good idea.
It's a really interesting point because, humans are a social species. And they have evolved we've all evolved to desire to help other people. And, gratitude is one of the most powerful feelings someone can have, because if you've received help or you've been given a gift, gratitude is the desire to give back. And that is how you stay in the tribe. That's how you continue to get food from the hunters who go out every day. And that was, the cement to early human tribes, and it represents an extension of, altruism, because it goes beyond related people or related individuals. You can find, the definition of altruism depends on who you ask, but if you define altruism as an individual giving to another individual without getting anything in return immediately, then you can find examples outside of humans of altruism. Like, for example, in ant colonies, most ants don't reproduce. There are the queens who do reproduce, and all the drone ants, the worker ants, who have half the DNA the queens do and are incapable of reproducing. And so from an evolutionary perspective, how is that advantageous to create individuals that can't reproduce? And why is it advantageous for those individuals to help other individuals if they can't reproduce anyway? And so that question is answered because all the ants are related to each other. And so if an ant cannot reproduce, but it helps the queen reproduce, and it has the queen's DNA, if it helps the queen reproduce, it is itself helping its own DNA to reproduce, even though that individual is not reproducing. And so that is a basis of altruism that can explain almost all behavior in animals. If individuals are not helping themselves, but they're helping others, they're almost always related, because then that satisfies that evolutionary checkbox of you need to help your own DNA reproduce. And so in humans, it's really interesting because, well, it goes one step beyond that. If you're in a tribe, you're not necessarily very related to that other person. You might be, since early groups were probably around 150 people, so someone could probably be fifth, sixth cousin or something. The math might be wrong, but you're only very vaguely related to these people, and yet you are, you're hunting for them, you're fixing their house, you're watching their kids, and that is, that's part of the asterisk for humans, is they will help others, not to help their own DNA reproduce, but for the good of the tribe, which ultimately does help themselves reproduce, but over a longer period of time. And I do think early on, in most cases, is what you were saying. These people are not. There's not some ideological portion of the brain that says you must help the good of the tribe because it helps everyone reproduce. It's because it makes you feel good. It makes you feel good to help other people, and that's why you do it. You have the idea, yes, I'm helping, I'm selfless, and that makes you feel good, and that's why you do it. But even then, that's not a hard rule, because you can have examples of there are videos of during a tsunami, people will jump in the water and drown to save a complete stranger. Examples like that really, really test that boundary of are there examples of actual altruism? Some people will say, well, maybe not because they feel good, but because I forget someone. There's an idea that all human behavior, boils down to avoiding pain or finding pleasure, and that seeing a stranger drown fills you with so much pain that you want to avoid it by jumping in and trying to save them. Some disagree. That's getting philosophical, but yeah, humans and their desire for a cohesive tribe or social unit definitely pushes the boundary of the altruistic question.
And philosophy coming in, because that's actually where I would imagine it seems like that's kind of a repeating theme. It's hard, just like you're talking about, to kind of separate. Evolution kind of just spreads out in terms of so many different aspects of. I've even heard one that I wanted to ask you about, which is cosmological natural selection. Ooh. But it kind of, the ideas, the core concepts of evolution, and beautiful as they are, it's probably one of the greatest things that I think humanity's ever really kind of put together. I think Darwin and all the people that came before him that got us there. But I lost my train of thought. Sorry.
Cosmological. Yeah, you use this phrase, cosmological natural
we can
evolution.
go into that. Yeah, and this is actually, so I think there's a really formal kind of theory around this, but I'll kind of just use it very roughly, which is cosmological natural selection. So the idea being, let's say that every time we have a black hole, that's when we actually get potentially a new universe can come into existence, right? And we have different laws of physics, or we can just do multiverse and say that different universes are kind of coming into existence all the time. And this cosmological natural selection hypothesis is one that says, well, only the universes that will actually exist are the ones that are going to be selected for that have the right conditions, right? So our universe just happens to be one of these universes where the conditions were right. The laws of physics at the cosmological constants for this universe just happen to be the right way. So it's kind of this natural selection process in terms of that tree, that branching that happens. So I thought that was a really interesting way to kind of tie these, what seemed like completely separate fields to me, or concepts, and then tie it together.
Yeah, I've heard of that before. Like why is the value of, why does an electron contain exactly, this many volts, or why is pi this number? And I remember reading, I think it was some physicist was discussing it, and he says he hates that idea because it can take a lot of the fun out of the physics, because instead of asking, why does an electron have exactly this voltage, you can just answer it by, oh, okay, it has to, or else the universe doesn't exist. And it's, to me, it is a really interesting question. Natural selection is, pretty much everywhere. And so I wouldn't be surprised if the very fundamental nature of the universe or multiple universes just comes down to, well, if it exists because it can, because it has the right conditions.
That makes a lot of sense. I've actually discussed a bit, I'll hand it over to you, Thomas, after, but the string theory is when I talk about the 10 dimensions. I don't know at what point, I think it might be the 6th or 7th dimension is now you have the sort of acclaimed popular term like the multiverse, where it's these, again, as you mentioned, Thomas, universes with different laws of physics, where the speed of light is only 3 times 10 to the 4th, right? Instead of 10 to the 8th. And how is that going to affect how the sun radiates energy from the nearby planets? And what if the force of gravity is far weaker?
Or even if suns can exist, right?
Maybe exactly.
You're right.
Yeah. So that totally falls right in line.
But going in that direction, what, Evan, and I think a fun question that I have that I often think about is, I look at evolution, natural selection, adaptation as really kind of fun. I don't want to say fundamental laws, because I know that means something different in the academic sense. But thinking about and kind of getting back to this, the original question that Dane brought up when we first started, which is around, is there any kind of inevitability around evolution, kind of the march of progress towards intelligence? But just kind of before we get there, is thinking about, if we did find other alien species, other life in the universe, do you think it would have to play by those same rules that us carbon-based life forms on this planet are playing by in terms of natural selection, evolution? Do you think that other life we'd find would have something similar?
Oh, yeah, certainly. Yeah, I'm certain about that. That's just, I mean, to me, that is a natural force of, that is intrinsic to life, is life reproduces, but it doesn't reproduce perfectly. And so if it reproduces imperfectly one time, which then leads it to reproduce even more, then you'll see more of those. I think that is any life will find. First of all, if we find life and it doesn't find us, then it's probably microbial, because Earth has been around, life has been around on Earth for, I think, 4 billion years. And life was multicellular for, I think, 500 million years. So it really took an incredibly long amount of time to get all that insanely fucking complicated and intricate cellular machinery to work just right before multicellular life could really take off.
Evan, this is a clean show, so watch your fucking mouth.
Oh.
No, no, that's exactly, and I was just going to say that's actually one of the most amazing things. So Earth, 4.5 billion years. Let's go with it. Let's say Earth is 4.5 billion years old. And what you'd find out is that slice from life being 4 billion years old, the first single cell, abiogenesis, I think that's the right term. But at pretty much as soon as it could happen, in terms of where the conditions on Earth were not extremely volatile, life somehow just comes into existence. We get life as pretty much as soon as it can happen. It seems like it did happen. And then to your point is that this extremely long period goes by before we get complex life, before we get multi-celled life. So what are kind of your thoughts around that? Have you kind of dug into that a little bit, or was there any kind of maybe leading hypotheses or theories around that?
Of what, early evolution or evolution in that first period of time?
I think take me to abiogenesis. So I guess what was kind of the prevailing theory in terms of when we get, and I don't know if I'm using the terminology correctly, but getting to that first moments of where we actually get kind of the single-celled life.
Yeah. It is the very first step is self-replicating molecules. If you look at early the early landscape of Earth had a whole bunch of chemicals, had a whole bunch of energy going around, there's a lot of lightning, a lot of heat, a lot of minerals, a lot of nutrients just kind of floating around, in the primordial soup, as they say. And first of all, we have no idea of how life started. We have a whole bunch of ideas, but it's really hard to prove because...
Is it fair to say we have no idea, or do you think
many ideas on how it could have started? I'll just say that. And the idea...
It seems like we've at least, because what I'm trying to stay away from, and I'll bring it up a little bit later on, is that I'm trying to stay away from that we don't need an explanation of God. It doesn't necessarily need to be there. We don't have to summon God into the picture to say that's how we had to get life in the first place. We have, us as humans, we have theories, we have ideas potentially how it happens. Granted, we haven't been able to answer it completely, or we haven't been able to prove any of these, I think, definitively, right?
Yeah.
That's Thomas's weak. That's his kryptonite. If once God comes in, he's like, oh no, my atheist bones are quivering.
That's right. Well, no, I was debating how funny it would be is if I just started with, Evan, today's format is going to be us going 10 rounds where you're going to try to actually dispute why I think the Earth is 6,000 years old.
Yeah. God it ends any further explanation because God did it. That's it. Oh, why does it look really old if it's actually really long? Well, God made it look really old. Why are there fossils? God made the fossils. It completely stops any explanation. But
there's one with Richard Dawkins where he's talking to a creation. I think he's talking to a rabbi. It's on YouTube. I forget what the clip is called, but he's talking to this rabbi, and he says, "You can't really believe that the Earth is 6,000 years old." Like that it came into existence 6,000 years ago. I think it was a rabbi. But anyways, you can't really believe that this happened. And he goes, surely we have fossils. We have dating techniques that, are able to, go back much further than this. And he goes, well, yeah, but God created the universe in, an aged state. He brought that into existence already aged to this point, to show as if it was 4.5 billion years ago. And you just see like Richard Dawkins, like he's just like, oh, fucking Christ, man. Are you serious? Are you fucking serious right now? That's your explanation for it?
Yeah. My favorite offshoot of that idea is last Thursdayism. Is that the entire universe was created last Thursday, and with everyone in place, memories of a life in place, everything. You can't disprove it. Prove me wrong. You can't. It's exactly.
Oh, this sounds like Boltzmann brains. Like it's easier. It's more likely that we just came into existence right now, this very moment, with our thoughts and everything, snap of a finger right now, versus a universe that had to support conditions for 13.8 billion years getting us to this point. Yeah. So we just so happen to have the memories, everything just as is, this snapshot just comes into existence. And you find out that it's almost, it's philosophically, it's interesting, but intellectually, you doesn't really lead you anywhere where you're going, oh, okay, I learned something new, or I've discovered something about the universe. So it's kind of just something that's out there hanging in the ether.
Yeah.
Last Thursdayism, I like it.
but anyway, back to So early life. The current leading ideas are that it probably happened once because everything is DNA based. So it could have, or rather not that it happened once, but that we are all descended from the very first life form. I think it's possible that there were a number of self-replicating molecules way in the beginning, but DNA outcompeted them, and so DNA is or a DNA-like structure it's a double helix, and on each side is a molecule that can only bind to one other kind of molecule. A's only bind with T's and C's bind with G's. And so if you were to take a strand of DNA, dip it into soup that's full of these amino acids, bases, nucleic bases, A, T, C's, and G's, you take that strand, you split it apart, then you have all of these sites available, and it's in this soup, and so they will all the A's in the soup will bind to all the T's and become a part of a new chain. And so with all the correct materials, you can take a strand, split it in half, and now you have two identical strands. And that idea is once DNA can start to replicate itself, that's the idea of the very first. Whether even that's life, because there's no metabolism, there's no it's hard to distinguish inside and outside if it's just a molecule floating around in soup making copies of itself. And then somewhere along the line, you have these naturally forming phospholipid bilayers, which is essentially the same concept as if you have oil in water, it will form little bubbles because that minimizes the surface area. And so natural processes, again, this is just a lower potential energy state. Then the idea is, eventually DNA ended up inside one of these, and proteins started to happen. I know very little on early life, but there's a lot of different ideas, and it's hard to it's nearly impossible to prove anything unless we can perfectly replicate early Earth conditions, which we can't. There was a famous experiment in the 50s which provided at the time a lot of evidence, or a piece of really good evidence for abiogenesis, and that was I forget the name, but it was essentially some scientists estimated the atmospheric gas ratios and pressures and mimicked that in a glass. There's this big rig. There was glass. There were condensers and spark generators, and so essentially they ran what they assumed to be the atmosphere through. They heated it, and they created sparks, or electric sparks, and eventually they ran that for a while, and they got a big collection of amino acids, which are the building blocks of life. It's proteins are very specific, intricate combinations of amino acids, and that was amazing at the time. And then it came out like 30 or 40 years later that new evidence arised, and their original estimations of the atmospheric conditions were wrong. They reran the experiment with what they currently think the conditions are, and those amino acids don't show up. And so it's really hard to you need to mimic the conditions. And actually, the current idea is now not that early life began on the surface, exposed to the atmosphere, but that it might have arisen near hydrothermal vents, which are underwater, and they spew. It's very warm water, and they're spewing tons and tons of different kinds of chemicals. A lot of very energy-rich chemicals, a lot of like sulfates, stuff that is just ready to bond to other stuff. And today there are lots of microbes that live around hydrothermal vents underwater, and the temperatures at the bottom of the ocean can get quite high, like over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And one cool thing to know is that if the sun were to disappear at this moment, the Earth freezes over, almost all life dies. All life dies on the surface. All fish die, and Earth is a frozen ball flowing through space. Those little microbes at the bottom of the geothermal vents will still be chugging along. So that's a lot of people think that that's where the first life came into, first replicating molecules and first cells arose there. But again, it's really hard to prove any of that. There's a whole lot of discussion about it.
And one of them that I was just thinking about, which is, I actually had never heard that before about the initial. I've heard the original experiment where they did when they were trying to see if they could get kind of the initial conditions and get kind of a sense of what started life, or start to come to some conclusions around that. I had heard about that study, but I didn't know that they actually had redid it with different initial conditions, because they actually found out it wasn't necessarily correct the first time they did it. So that's interesting that they weren't able to repeat the results. So I didn't actually know that. So thank you for that, Evan. But the other one I was thinking about, which is panspermia. I think, is that the right one? Mm-hmm. Which is, explain what panspermia, because I actually really like that idea, and I think it'll get us to maybe where we'll start to talk a little bit around getting towards alien life and maybe intelligence. But let's talk about panspermia.
Yeah, that's the idea that life came from another planet, which is a really interesting idea. It kind of doesn't solve any problems, because it just kind of pushes it to another planet. But essentially, the basis is that there are microbes today that could potentially survive being ejected, being in space for years, and then entering the atmosphere on another planet and still being alive, and then spreading life there. There's
tardigrades.
Yeah, tardigrades, a number of others. Tardigrades are the super famous one, little water bears. Yeah, they can exist in space
vacuum,
for months.
I think.
Yeah.
And you can nuke them. You can stick them in the microwave. You can eat them. Like, you can throw them in the fire pit. You can do whatever you want to these sons of bitches. And they're still, I actually think what it ends up being is that there's a whole family of tardigrades, the species, where different ones have different resilient characteristics. Mm-hmm. But I think on the whole, they're extremely resilient to pretty much anything we throw at them.
Yeah. And so the idea is that, it might have come from Mars. Mars was wet really long ago. Life could have started there, and then they got hit by an asteroid, and then another rock holding these microbes got sent into space, crash landed on Earth, and that's how life started there. That, to me, seems less likely than abiogenesis on one planet, because, well, it still requires abiogenesis, and then it also requires a whole nother set of circumstances.
Yeah,
that is random. That is random abio, or a random panspermia. I've heard the idea that life was planted by other intelligent life to spread the good word of life and self-reproduction. So there's a lot of different ideas. And they're all really interesting.
So getting back to now, I want to talk a little bit around intelligence. And so there's a famous image that I've seen, and I think, for my understanding, is it is actually something academically that gets kind of frowned upon. There's the image, I think it's called the March of Progress, where it shows kind of a Lucy-looking, or kind of an ape-like primate, very hunched over, and then it shows this progression where it's getting taller, and each subsequent generation looks more and more human-like, until eventually at the end of it, you've got a human at the end of, with or Homo sapien on a computer, right? So it basically kind of gives this sense that evolution is marching towards kind of this ideal result, which is human intelligence, or humans in general. So is that something? I guess the first point of that, what do you feel about this march of progress, kind of this image that's kind of out there? How does that paint evolution, or do you think that leads to a lot of misconceptions? And then tie that to maybe the next part of that is getting into how intelligence maybe arises, or is it a necessity that intelligence arises because of evolution.
Yeah. The March of Progress was definitely harped upon by my professors. It's one of the early ideas of evolution, of that evolution being teleological, that there is an end goal in mind, and that there is there is a direction that evolution is going, and that it is inevitable that humans will that the early apes evolved so that humans could evolve eventually, and that it is inevitable that intelligent humans exist. That's Bubkiss. And intelligence on top of that. I mean, if you were to look, and that March of Progress image is very misleading as well, because it'd be sort of like if you were to create another March of Progress image, except with you and a bunch of your relatives. It would be like your great great grandfather, and then your great 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 aunt, and then your great great uncle, and then your great second cousin. If you look at the evolutionary tree of humans, it's a tree. There's not one path you can follow that leads to humans. It's a number of diverged species, and so if you were to look at the tree of humans, all of those images in that March of Progress are all offshoots. They're all diverged species. Those are not. Homo erectus did not evolve into the next species. It's like saying chimps evolved into humans, and it's a still very widespread belief, big misconception about evolution. I think still in the U.S., over 50% of people don't think evolution happened, and yeah, you can. That's another topic.
No,
but,
I ain't come from no fucking monkey, Evan. Oh no, I'm gonna piss people off with that. Sorry, I did not come from any fucking monkey. Oh man, that drives me crazy. Yeah. It drives me crazy that that's the stance. But 50%, is that really, like, in terms of that's what you remember it being?
It's around there. It's probably decreased. Hopefully, it's decreased, but. Yeah, I mean, it's one of the misconceptions that this evolves into this, evolves into this, evolves into this, and it is, it's a very very simplified view, and yeah, evolution is certainly not directional in that way. And as for intelligence, that is an interesting question, whether intelligence is inevitable, and you guys said no, and I agree with that. Intelligence is not. Intelligence is just another trait. It would be like saying long necks are inevitable because it helps you reproduce. It helps giraffes reproduce. So long necks are good in giraffes. If you had a really intelligent giraffe, it probably wouldn't have survived as well as other giraffes, because you can equate intelligence essentially with brain size. If you have a bigger brain, you can run more brain calculations, you can recognize more complicated patterns. And so it is just one of the many traits that helps a species reproduce. And if you look at a lot of animals that who have evolved, over the last many millions of years, brain size, each species has a brain, has the brain size it needs to reproduce the most. A cow does not need a lot of computational power. Eat grass, chew it back up, have sex, and stay in a group. And as long as all
sounds like a pretty sweet life.
And moo.
Let's, Dane. I think and moo. I think we're This sounds pretty good.
And so if you had if you create another species of genius cows who, in addition to those four, can also solve differential equations and debate philosophy.
A Newton cow?
Yeah.
Cow Newton?
Exactly.
Oh my goodness.
I'll bring it back. Why can't we have sex with intelligent cows? They know as well as we do.
Dane, now Dane, I don't know, I'm sure you do know this about your brother, but your brother's feelings about interspecies marriage and legalizing it. But yeah, why can't we have sex with cows, right, Dane?
Especially if they're intelligent. That just narrows the boundary even more, right?
Or is that the motivation to have sex with cows? Don't worry. Throw away the science. Mm-hmm. I'm intelligent. Cow not as intelligent. Let's mix that. let's naturally select for more intelligent. Let's mix those genes. Let's see what happens.
There you go.
There we go. I like that idea. My other ideas weren't as strong, but I'm going to sit on that one now. I'm going to use that one.
I'm going to sit on that hard.
Yeah, if you had a really intelligent cow, then it would have a really big brain, which would require a lot more grass. And well, if it's solving differential equations is not helping it eat more grass, and so that one does not make as many smart cow babies, and the dumb cows make more because they don't have to spend as much energy feeding their giant brain, or feeding their small brain rather. They can just focus on eating grass and having sex.
But I mean, couldn't you say the same for the early? I mean, if we go back far enough in our common ancestors, and I know we haven't really defined what is intelligence and what we mean by kind of human. I mean that in the sense of like human level intelligence. But couldn't you say that it really played? It was no great benefit to our early ancestors, our very common ancestors, to have that level, or to have the brains that were starting to be capable of that kind of higher complex level of thought. And do you kind of rationalize it as something that just ends up being kind of a byproduct of the evolutionary pressures, the natural selection pressures that we somehow were able to repurpose and, start running these other subroutines, on our brain? Or how do you kind of, because it feels like that's kind of the same, just like we were talking about the cows. At first, it doesn't seem like having intelligence. It seems like it's a huge cost to bear in terms of having these big brains that require a significant amount of our calories.
Yeah. So the very initial where brains started to get big was when our very distant ancestors started to group up. The big brains at first were not helpful because they were using tools or making tools, but it was all social intelligence. The big brains were important at first because a larger cohesive group with more socially aware and socially intelligent individuals function better. If you have bigger groups, a larger group of individuals requires more cooperation. And the environmental conditions of Africa at the very beginning of human evolution was things were getting drier. So there was a lot of rainforest. There was a lot of jungle where chimpanzees exist now in groups of about like 20 or 30. Things were getting drier. There were more savanna, and resources were becoming more far apart. That was one of the big pressures that was one of the big evolutionary pressures towards bipedalism, is when resources were far apart, it's more efficient to walk on 2 feet over long distances than with 4 feet. And so that, in addition to bigger groups, if resources are spread apart and they're more concentrated than at one particular patch of resources, you're going to end up with more individuals. And if they can cooperate, then they'll do better than if they're constantly fighting at each other. And so early humans were getting smart because it helped them cooperate with others. It helped them have just a general social understanding, starting cooperation, give and take, scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, and that sort of bonding. And that's where the brain started to develop, was for social purposes. And then once the savanna continues to grow, the jungle shrinks, the resources are more spread apart, bipedalism starts to become widespread in humans because of its efficiency over long distance. That frees up hands, and that was the next significant step. Once those are freed, then this big brain has even more material to work with for tool making and basic basic tool making. And so it is believed that it was repurposed. The large brain was repurposed. Well, not necessarily repurposed, but built upon from social intelligence came before practical tool making intelligence. And so that is what is believed to be the spark of this, the path down intelligence, and ultimately it was environmental conditions that triggered it. If there, it's possible that if there were jungle the entire time and large groups never needed to get formed out of necessity, then intelligence would not be as advantageous, because it does. The thing about evolution is that even if there's a really good path to go down, you need to take a path of many, many very, very small steps. Every single mutation, every trait needs to be more advantageous than the last, or else it won't exist. It's like if you're trying to convert a bicycle into like a dolly, for moving boxes. It'd be great if you could just take all the parts of a bike and then reassemble it at once to create a dolly. In evolution, you need to do that piecewise, and each piece needs to be better than the last. And so even though intelligence might be advantageous, intelligent cows, it might be better off for them because, well, if they can talk and speak, then maybe human animal rights activists, get more traction, and, it's totally a path that they'll be more successful on. But immediately, intelligence does not get any benefit to them. And so that is why there does need to be a very specific set of circumstances for intelligence to reach the level of making computers and whatnot.
And I really like the way that you kind of walked us through the kind of your thoughts and the way that it's kind of taught, because all of that makes sense to me in terms of those evolutionary pressures, natural selection pressures, environmental pressures that kind of led us to this path we're at now. And then the other thing I was thinking about is kind of the happenstance of it too, which is you think about if I think about successful or like apex predators in terms of really, I think by the time, I guess there was some predator, where some apex predators towards humans or Homo sapiens or early primates at that time. But I don't think we had much in terms of competition with other large animals that we really had to worry about that were actively kind of hunting us as their primary food source. Versus if I'm going back far enough, I'm thinking about kind of dinosaurs. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking about how successful they were in terms of gigantic. Really, there's no chance it seems really hard for me to kind of imagine a world where humans would have been successful at the same time that we had dinosaurs roaming around. We'd have been great little snacks for them, right? So it seems like what would have been successful is like very small mammals, which would have been able to kind of hide, take refuge, shelter. And we just so happened to be lucky that an asteroid, the thing we fear about now, something that actually impacted Earth, caused some catastrophic event, wiped out the dinosaurs, and gave us a chance to get our foothold.
Yeah. There's a lot of pressures driving evolution, and not just environmental, but what other animals exist. But I will disagree with what you said about there not being any other competition. There were lots of other large animals in Africa at that time, and there's an interesting pattern you can see. In Africa right now, you have a large number of large animals. You have water buffalo, you've got cheetahs and lions, hyenas, and if you look in a lot of other places like North America, you don't have anywhere near that diversity of large animals. You've got deer, bears, buffalo,
moose.
Yeah, we got wolves.
Cows.
Let's go down we got cows, baby.
We got cows.
We got cows.
But if you look, and the reason there aren't any is because humans arrived. And there used to be megafauna. There used to be in Australia, in Europe, in America. If you go back to the Ice Age, or even before the Ice Age, before humans arrived in North America, you would see a very similar level of diversity in large animals that you see today in Africa. There were the equivalent. There were bison. There were giant ground sloths. There were saber-toothed cats and woolly mammoths. And humans arrived and then killed them all, hunted them to extinction. And the reason that happened is because those animals evolved without humans. And then humans came in with their tools, and a lot of the times these large animals weren't even afraid of humans. You could walk up to a woolly mammoth, throw a bunch of spears at it, and kill it, because the mammoth is not afraid of something small, because if it sees a small deer, it's not going to be afraid of it. It sees a small human with a stick. Okay, oh, I'm dying. What's happening? But in Africa, humans evolved along with lions and all these other large animals, and so they had a chance to evolve alongside, and so they were not wiped out immediately. And same thing with in Australia, there were a whole bunch of megafauna there. I think they also had giant ground sloths, like huge. They were standing on their back feet. They were over 20 feet tall, and then humans arrived and then hunted them to extinction. And so while there was competition for early humans, and it was a fierce competition.
Is it competition, I guess, for like was it competition in the sense that we were a primary food source, or is it competition in the sense that we were going after kind of the same pie, the same food sources that we were competing over, say, like, I don't know, other large mammals, other large animals in Africa?
Yeah. So competition. If you're to look at an ecological definition of competition, is they're trying to use the same resources, and I'm sure lions did not like humans and would probably attack them if they were threatened. But I don't think once fire and tools evolved, I don't think humans were a primary prey of lions. I don't think lions would go stalk a tribe of humans and try to kill some. It probably was too risky. But they were competing. They both hunted the ungulates, the deer, the impalas, all those kinds of things. There was competition in that way. So yeah, predator-prey interaction. I'm sure plenty of ancient humans got eaten by lions, but it probably wasn't their primary food source. Yeah, I forgot where I was going with that.
No, I was just thinking about how that it's kind of, I guess I don't think about it that way, but what maybe would have consumed our early ancestors, we've kind of evolved to that. We would have, just like you said, there were larger mammals, that were around, but humans kind of came in with intelligence, or came in with tools, and were able to kind of cause them to go extinct. And really, we've kind of shaped the planet in such a way where I think, at least, it doesn't seem like there really isn't any direct, fear of me going outside today. Maybe in other places there is, but I'm not really I don't think I have to really be concerned about being, the primary food source or being consumed, right? Anything that was like that, we would have either caused A to go extinct, or B has already gone extinct, which allowed us to kind of take our foothold. Is that right?
Yeah. At this point, we have certainly, once we were out of Africa, then the competition was gone. We were an invasive species. Because
a competition amongst other kind of Neanderthals, other things like that. I'm sure there was plenty of competition in that sense. We're not necessarily a primary food source.
Oh, direct competitors. Yeah,
we were kind of direct competitors where we're actually seeing intelligence on the same level. My understanding is that Neanderthals kind of get painted in a very poor light or inaccurate light, where their intelligence was pretty much the same, more or less on par with Homo sapiens.
I think they did actually have bigger brains. They might have been a bit brighter.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. And so that would have been the arms race, right? Where you're actually kind of seeing where the playing field, so to speak, is more level in that regards. The same maybe tactics we were applying to these larger mammals, we were actually getting applied, that were being applied against Homo sapiens.
Yeah. And the case of Neanderthals are interesting. But yeah, I mean, competition in Africa was intense because human population was almost stagnant. Very, very little growth in Africa in early human populations, which means they were not wildly successful. They were another part of the environment. You take a trip back to very early Africa, and you take a look around, and okay, there are the lions doing their things. Oh, there's some humans, making their fire. There's a group of impala. They were part of. They very fit in, because that was before tool making, and during very early tool making. Humans were about on par with naturally evolved animals. But once we got the hang of language, and once we got the hang of tool making, then we pretty much cheated evolution. Because if any other animal wanted to be improved in any way. Let's, if an anteater wanted or needed sharper claws for some reason, the ground got harder anyway, and it needs to evolve sharper claws. That's generations and generations of small mutations building up over time, or tens of thousands, 100,000 years before an anteater can get sharper claws. But for humans, evolution started to happen intellectually and with ideas. And when you have language, then any advancement made by one person can not only go to their offspring, but to go to everyone else in the tribe and their offspring. If someone comes up with a really good way of making a bow, then everyone else in the tribe now knows how to make a bow, and all their children are going to know how to make a bow. Instead of one mutation over generations and generations, we started to outpace evolution. And once we were out of Africa, then we killed all the megafauna and the other and all the other continents. Then we had all these open niches. Now that the saber-tooth cats are extinct, now there's all these impalas. Now there's all these deer that we can hunt that they're not hunting anymore. Oh, we've hunted them to extinction. Okay, maybe we'll try agriculture. And so once we started outpacing, and at this point, there's this is a human planet. No two ways about it. We have utterly transformed everywhere we live, and the planet itself to be as accommodating to humans as possible, because nothing can keep up evolutionarily.
And I guess that's a good segue, which is I was just thinking about what does evolution tell us about, maybe, or kind of like the prevailing theories about evolution's role in the next generations of humans, the future of Homo sapiens. Do we actually see? I mean, are we still evolving today? Are there still pressures for us to change, like that we actually see? Maybe that we've been able to get a sense that there's kind of a general direction that humanity will go down, or what does that look like, I guess, as applied in terms of humanity and evolution and natural selection? Is there any kind of thoughts around that?
That's a good question. I mean, natural selection never ceases to go. That always happens, but evolution doesn't need to happen. That is, there are many examples of species who hit a point that's just really good, and then they don't evolve. There's probably a lot of little mutations here and there, tiny improvements, but the main species doesn't evolve anymore, and there are conditions for that. And an example, like a lot of sharks are virtually identical to how they were, tens of millions of years ago. Crocodiles, and if you look at the fossil record, there used to be this idea that evolution happened really, really slowly, and that if you look at the fossil record, evolution often happens incredibly quickly. There was a problem when people started to really look at the fossil record of, we have a bunch of fossils that are the same, and then there's this one period where like a bunch go extinct, and then we get a whole bunch of new fossils, and like, where are they coming from? We thought evolution happened really slowly, and what often happens is evolution happens in the sense of in geologic time, happens very quickly, and then everyone just kind of settles in. If there's not a lot of change, if the environment isn't changing, then life sort of hits a steady state. Nothing really evolves much, and it's just sort of status quo for millions of years. And so you'll keep finding the same fossils millions of years apart from each other, and then asteroid, and then bam, tons of new species happens relatively very quickly, and then it hits a steady state and it stops again, and then it's just chilling for another few million years. And so humans today are still under the effects of natural selection. You can never escape natural selection. But as far as the directions that, how humans are going to evolve in the future, evolution in human times, in human sense, does happen quite slowly. It's tens, hundreds of generations before you can even really start to barely tell a difference. Where humans evolve is a really good question. It's we have a wide variety of environments right now, and you see the result of adaptations to those wide variety of environments. People look different in different areas. If it's sunnier, people are going to be darker. If it's warmer, people are going to have less hair. And so Earth as a whole does not have one environment, and so there's not a great drive in any one direction for humans as a whole right now, it seems. Some people are saying people are evolving to be smarter. Some people are saying people are evolving to be dumber. It's hard to tell because it's happening so slowly, and there's so many people, and they're growing so quickly, the population, that it's hard to grab any trends. But where evolution fits, this is a big segue, but where evolution fits more today is the evolution of artificial intelligence, because that uses exactly the same principles that evolution of life and natural selection. You're creating neural networks that you're using literally exactly the same principles that natural selection does. You're testing, you're recombining, and you're taking the most successful ones, and you're testing those, recombining it, and you're finding the. So I think evolution, in the broadest sense, as far as humans are concerned, evolution is mostly happening with things that we can see, like the evolution of artificial intelligence, because that's evolution on a scale that we can actually observe. Evolution in humans, biological evolution, is very slow compared to what we're used to with change. Personally, I don't know where we would evolve in a direction. Probably, people might evolve to be a little shorter if people start. If everyone reaches a similar level of standard of living, then people are probably going to have to get used to, having a lower standard of living. If everyone in the world wanted to live the standard of living that the average American does, we'd need like 3 Earths worth of resources. So our standard of living is not sustainable for everybody. But I'm sure with technological advances, we'd be able to change that. But if anything, I think people will probably be with limited resources. People get smaller. There are fossils of. Well, no, they're not. Are they fossils? They might just. No, I'm not sure. There are remains of an ancient human species on islands. Island dwarfism is a common phenomenon where on islands resources are more limited, and so the smaller animals are favored because they use less resources. And so there are a lot of examples of small mammoths. They were like 3 feet tall or like 4 or 5 feet tall mammoths living on an island, and there were 3 feet tall people. There were human species about 3 feet tall living, or remains of them living on islands off in Southeast Asia, I think. And so with
Flores, man.
Yeah, they were pretty much hobbits, and they were.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I started having this funny image about the different sizes that planets could come in, and if you had a smaller Earth, and you just kind of, I know I'm stretching to get there, but your point is really fair, which is, size is a luxury, or is predicated on the fact that you need to have enough resources to keep that size, to have animals that big. But if you had limited resources, it would only make sense that you restrict the overall size of the life that can happen. So then I'm picturing like a mini Earth,
a lot of little people
with just midgets little people all over it. I like that. I had a quick one, Evan, just because we probably got another 10 minutes or so, and then we'll wrap. But I had a question, which is, even if we saw that there was a trend towards something that maybe that we're seeing where evolution, and granted it's happening at a time scale that's maybe even almost imperceptible from generation to generation for humans, but we've gotten to the point where technology, just like you were kind of talking about, has really taken the reins, where we're able to almost control. Do you think we would prevent, if we could actually get a sense for, maybe I could definitively show to you, generation over generations, our brains are actually somehow getting smaller for whatever reason. And maybe it's something to do environmentally, so it's happening across the board, or maybe it has to do with any number of reasons. Do you think at this point that we would interject. Like we'll take control. We'll try to take control over that to push it in a favorable direction.
Mm.
And this gets into maybe a little bit of like CRISPR and starting to try to influence the overall direction, as opposed to it being, and I don't want to say it's a blind process, because I know evolution, natural selection is a little more than that. But do you think that that kind of control, that influence, that's more or less the direction, that's kind of the future of it, is one where it's where humans are kind of at the steering wheel?
I think you're totally right there. Just because gene editing is, well, we can see it today. It's not, we're not, my high school science teacher told me that we'd be the first generation with designer babies. I'm not sure how right he was there, but it's certainly possible in the future. And I think, once we're able to consistently modify DNA in humans, well, then now DNA sort of falls under the technology category of extremely rapid change in comparison to natural evolution. And so, I think you're completely right there. I think any changes in the human genome, any directions that they go, are going to be driven by humans. Granted, I think it's going to be a small proportion of the population that have access to these, and you'd have to have you'd have to have a large amount of optimism to think it's going to hit everyone at some point.
Well, but even introducing it, right? That's the unknown. That's the risk. That's the concern. That's the part where we don't actually. What happens when you introduce something like that, a genetic change? Because then it'll propagate, right? It'll spread. Maybe it's not successful. Maybe it dies out. Whatever. That tree line is extinguished. That gene pool is extinguished. But it could spread very rapidly, right? There's a concern around what would happen when we introduce something like that. Maybe we really influence and we're able to kind of spread this very fast, very effectively.
Yeah, and I think, I definitely think that'll be, that certainly lies in the future. And I think a great piece of evidence for this is the fact that we're already doing it with our food. Artificial selection is, I think, a lot of people do not know how incredibly prevalent artificial selection was since humans started agriculture. Breeding, if you go back 2,000 years to a sheep herder in the Asian steppe and explain to him Darwinian evolution, he'd buy it, I'm sure, because he knows, when I breed these sheep that have really fluffy wool, their children and have really fluffy wool, and so I'm going to keep doing that until I have really fluffy sheep. And that Darwin was a huge part of the origin of species, was saying evolution happens right now. Look, people are breeding. Inheritance obviously exists. His whole origin of species was pretty much inheritance exists because we do it already. Animals create too many offspring for them all to survive. Therefore, the best offspring survive. Therefore, species can change over time naturally. That's essentially was the pillars of his proof, and artificial selection being one of the most crucial aspects of it, because that essentially proves evolution happens if it can be directed by humans. And so, agriculture was starting in around Darwin's time is when people got really, really serious about keeping track and adding all those Enlightenment scientific ideals to creating really good livestock, really good crops, and breeding the perfect strains of food in its many forms was very common. Agriculture has been filled with it, since it began. And today, breeding is too slow now. If you want to get a really good strain of tomatoes, it can take years to take the really good strains today and then breed them and artificially select them. And now all agriculture is gene modifying and distributing clones. If you want to make really good tomatoes, you can buy a bunch of really good tomato seeds, or you buy a bunch of clones shipped out from a factory. They're all identical and they've all got the really good pieces of DNA and you plant them, and it's much faster. If you want to even better strain of tomatoes, you don't go looking around for the tomatoes and then start, mixing the pollen and getting seeds, and because that takes a really long time. You just send it to the lab, add in these new pieces of DNA, and you're good to go. And so already artificial selection is too slow, or is slower than we have stuff that's faster than it. And so, humans have had a little bit of a dabble in artificial selection. Eugenics was a popular idea a while ago of applying artificial selection to humans. And so I imagine people will probably have the same hesitancy when it comes into, breeding better people with, gene modifying, because it is pretty much the same idea as eugenics. It's just faster. And so I think people eventually will have enough money to, say, screw what you think. I'm going to make my kids really smart and healthy. What are you going to do about it? So I think in the future, artificial selection, natural evolution is too slow for us if we want to make any changes. And so gene editing is certainly, if humans have a large scale genomic change in the future, it'll certainly be gene editing.
And there's moves that we can't, well, I guess I shouldn't say because I don't know for certain, but I would say that there's certain genetic changes that maybe just will never happen because of where we're at in our lineage as how we've evolved. Like, it's just not going to happen. Just like you said, you're not going to take a bicycle and somehow get a cart out of it. You can't go back. You're kind of, was it Richard Dawkins talks about Mount Improbable? You can go forward, you can keep progressing, but you can't go back and I'm not going to again develop flippers, right? All of a sudden, it's not going to work out that way. But we can, the rules of the game with technology are drastically different in terms of what we could do, what we could influence. Maybe to get even bigger brains, it would require a completely different set of circumstances that would never happen naturally, right? In terms of this Earth, or would require something that's drastically outside what the limits are. But because we can go in there and start controlling the genes, the way that they're expressed, we could actually influence that. So I like the rules of the game have changed for us, as well as just like what you're talking about, as well as that timeline in which things need to happen. So, was it the 1950s chicken? I think there's an example of where they were showing a chicken from like the 1920s, and they show the modern day chicken.
Monstrous.
It's fucking gigantic. Yeah. Oh man.
They've turned into muscle producing organisms for us now. Yeah, it's
pretty much
enormous.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
With gene editing, we can leap from peak to peak on Mount Improbable. You have what I was saying, when under certain environmental conditions, species will just sort of hit a stable point and they won't evolve anymore because there's no real direction they can go. There's no major improvements they can make. A shark is not at the top of the mountain, but it's hit a local peak and it can't go down to go up again. But with humans, if we're on a peak, we don't need to go down to go up again. We can just go straight to the next peak through gene editing. And so I think that will definitely, the rules have certainly changed as far as working with the raw materials of evolution. We're not constrained by what has happened already, or, we're doing what we can.
Evan, I think that is a great note to actually segue us out. So I want to thank you for your time, your expertise, and shedding light into this. Is absolutely, I know myself, this has been very educating for me, and I'm going to go look up things after this. And so, Dane, I'm sure that you've probably got a lot of things that you're going to go bug Evan about, who you have access to, I'm assuming, all the time.
This has been a lot of fun.
Great resource. Really, it's been a lot of fun.
Evan, I want to make sure, too, was there anything that you wanted to kind of close out for us with, as far as any kind of thoughts, anything that's on top of mind, anything that you wanted to share before we end our episode today?
I have no idea. Unprompted ending note. I got
What's your raw emotion?
Dane does this to me. Yeah, Dane does this to me all the time. How's your experience? Did you? Yeah, you just say, Thomas, tell us something thought provoking at the end of the episode. And at this point,
it goes across. Thomas, no pressure, but this is the ending, man. Like, gotta make it good. We had a lot of momentum. Don't fuck it up.
I think my favorite one that I gave was take a penny, leave a penny.
Yeah.
I think somehow I came. Yeah. Anyways.
But yeah, no worries, no rush if nothing comes to mind. It was definitely an interesting conversation. There's still a whole lot more to discuss. This topic seems to be never ending, and every day it gets more relevant as we take genetics and take evolution into our own hands. So thanks again for joining, Evan, and thanks for watching.